Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I think it is worthwhile reflecting on how much supply chains are likely to shift over the course of the next 10 to 15 years. We are, I think, at the start of a process of dramatic change in the nature of global trade, particularly of trade in goods. But I think to understand this, we need to look back at the past and at what has happened to globalization during the third industrial revolution, which began in the 1970s. What we have seen really since the Nixon shock back in 1971-72 is a process where global trade has fairly steadily increased as a share of global GDP in real terms. But what this process of increased global trade has been mainly about an increase in complexity of supply chains around the world. So we've moved from what might be termed the imperial model of trade, import raw materials, manufacture a product, export the finished product, to one where we have really transnational trade involving multiple different transactions in order to produce a good. This is no longer raw materials in, finished product out, but you are picking up a component here and a component there, putting them together in a third country, shifting that to a fourth country, which adds it to something else, which packages it in a fifth country, and so on and so forth. The increased complexity of global trade is what has motivated the World Trade Organization to start looking at trade in value added, a new concept which attempts to disaggregate sort of the import and export parts of different components around the world and to try and get a better evaluation of what is actually going on in global trade. This process of the third industrial revolution, increasing complexity, continual outsourcing of trade, has been aimed at increasing efficiency, primarily focusing on the efficiency of labor markets and by producing in the lowest cost method possible. However, the process of the third industrial revolution, I think, has largely run its course. And in the years immediately before the pandemic, global trade in mercantile trade terms as a share of global GDP leveled out and then started to decline. And this, I think, is reflecting the changes of the fourth industrial revolution just starting to impact global trade and the complexity of global supply chains. As we look ahead, I think that we are going to see a further reduction in global trade as a share of global GDP. Now, of course, in the last 12 to 18 months, global trade has risen as a share of global GDP, but this is not indicative of the trends that we are going to be following. This is simply reflecting the fact that as we came out of the pandemic, people spent money on goods rather than services. And because goods are a lot more traded than services, inevitably that led to a surge in demand for traded goods, which then led to a temporary rise in trade as a share of GDP. As we now move back to a more normalized pattern of trading between goods and services, I think the structural forces which work to reduce the complexity of supply chains and are going to shrink global trade as a share of GDP will start to exert themselves. So when we look now at the fourth industrial revolution, what are the trends here and what does this mean for global supply in the coming years? We are looking at a process of automation, of robotics, of digitization, issues like social media. All of these have a bearing on global trade and global supply chains. What we are effectively facing, however, are two different forces acting on global supply, a force of localization and a force of deglobalization. Both of these trends will reduce trade as a share of GDP, but the implications of these two trends, I think, are very, very significant. Localization is essentially about companies choosing to produce closer to their customer base because it is more efficient for them to do so. This is related to robotics, automation, other factors. Deglobalization is when politicians interfere in the free market and through the imposing of quotas, sanctions, and of course trade taxes or tariffs seek to alter supply chains in a way which is not efficient for the overall economy. So we have these two competing forces working together, both of which will reduce trade as a share of GDP. If we look at the forces of localization first, why would a company that has just spent 30 years looking to outsource, to increase the complexity of its supply chain, why would a company now choose to produce closer to the customer base? Well, the answer here, I think, is that the main motive for globalization and increased supply chain complexity in the third industrial revolution was about lower labor costs, choosing to produce where it was most efficient in terms of labor input. And that, of course, makes sense because traditionally labor costs are around 70% of a product's price. What we are now seeing, however, is a shift in a slightly different direction because automation, robotics, digitization mean that we are doing capital for labor substitution. And the marginal cost of labor is no longer the main driver of choosing where to locate. The advantage of producing closer to the customer base lies in a number of different factors, specifically waste control, customization of product, transport costs, security of supply chain, and reputational risk. All of these are factors that are changing significantly in the fourth industrial revolution. The waste issue refers obviously both to economic and to environmental waste. And there is an advantage to producing closer to the customer base. Because of course, the closer to the customer you are, the more that you can produce effectively on demand. Now we have instances where globalization in the third industrial revolution has led to significant economic and environmental waste, which is now being rethought in the fourth industrial revolution. The fast fashion industry is an obvious example of this. Roughly one third of all clothes in US stores are never worn. They are burnt as fuel. The reason for this is that clothing produced in Asia has roughly a 6-week lead time before it can be produced, shipped, and then distributed in US retail stores. What that means is that US clothing retailers have to overorder and hold excess inventory because a 6-week lead time is not acceptable. I have some teenage nieces, and I can assure you that if one of my teenage nieces goes into a store and cannot find the item she wants in the size she wants immediately, the consequences will be extremely unpleasant. As a result, we have deliberate excess inventory being held in the fast fashion sector in order to counter the fact that there is a 6-week lead time. This excess inventory is waste because it is likely to be burnt, it is never likely to be consumed, but the low cost of production has allowed that waste to be fitted into the overall price. As we now start to see the rise of automation, however, what that means is that we can start replacing labor-intensive production with capital-intensive production and shift to higher labor cost countries, and therefore start producing a lot closer to the consumer. Clearly, if clothing is produced again in the United States, as is starting to be the case, the lead time is not 6 weeks, the lead time is maybe 48 hours. You're producing effectively on demand, and the cost of waste then starts to come down. So automation and robotics and the cost of waste combine to simplify and contract supply chains. Customization is also something which I think gives an incentive to produce closer to the consumer. Increasingly, we are finding that the increases in technology allow us to customize products specifically to the needs of the client. In that situation, again, where you have a more automated process, it does make sense to produce closer to the customer if possible, again, to reduce delivery times. Because a customized product obviously being made on demand, if you then add a 6-week delivery time to that after the product has been completed, that's going to drag out the process of getting the customized product to the client. Whereas if you are selling a customized product which is being manufactured very close to the client, then you've got a far faster turnaround. The client is likely to be happier. Transport costs, obviously during the pandemic and the immediate aftermath, have become a very big feature. The uncertainty about transport costs is something which has created significant problems for a number of businesses. We are now in an environment where transport costs are coming down, but that is simply reflecting the lower demand as we come into a period of weaker economic activity. As we look ahead, again, the environmental costs of transport as well as the monetary costs of transport are likely to be something that consumers are increasingly sensitive to. The carbon footprint of any product is becoming a target over social media, and that is something, again, that companies, I think, are going to increasingly consider. If you can change your production process, simplify the supply chain, produce closer to the customer, you will significantly reduce costs in terms of transport, both environmental and economic. To give an example of this, I live in a village in the west of England, and this village has its own baker. The baker is a computer-controlled robot that sits at the back of the village convenience store, and it bakes bread typically 4 or 5 times a day. That reduces waste, of course, because we have almost production on demand. But it also has significant implications in terms of the transport costs, because rather than producing a loaf of bread and transporting it around the country, which is a large, bulky process, we are baking on demand. You are simply transporting flour and yeast around the country, far smaller quantities involved, far cheaper in terms of the transport. You then bake right next to the customer base, and you significantly reduce the transport costs. The pandemic has also increased concerns about supply chain security. Events in other countries can lead to problems in getting supply through if you have a long and complicated supply chain. And that, again, I think is urging simplification. Clearly, if a country is going into lockdown again, supply in that country is going to be restricted, but then so is demand. What firms, I think, are increasingly keen to avoid is having one country in lockdown and another country not, and having, therefore, a lack of supply because one country is restricting activity when another country is still experiencing normalized demand. So supply chain security is becoming a further significant issue. Finally, when it comes to localization, I would not underestimate the importance of reputation risk. We're in an environment where brand values are increasingly significant, where the role of social media in boosting a brand, but also in destroying a company's brand, is very, very powerful. in this situation where I think the role of brand value goes up, but also the risks to brand value become more intense, companies are going to want to have closer and closer supervision of the supply chain. Because if you continue to outsource and something is happening remote from your corporate headquarters, perhaps with a supply chain supplier, rather than a company under your direct control, the potential damage to your brand is very, very significant. Something we have seen repeatedly, particularly in the world of fashion, sportswear, and so on, where scandals with factory safety, working standards, child labor, and so on have become very, very toxic to a number of brands over the years. So taking all of these factors together, I think that companies will find it more efficient to do capital for labor substitution, simplify the supply chains, and move production closer to the customer base in many, many sectors. Clearly, this does not work in all sectors. Clearly, commodities will still need to be transported around the world, but localization is, I think, going to be a force that we see increasing in the coming years. Alongside this, and rather more concerning, we have the deglobalization force, which is where politicians become increasingly involved in the process of international trade. And deglobalization is inefficient because deglobalization is a process which tells companies to produce in the second best location. A company has chosen where to allocate its supply chain, presumably on the grounds of efficiency, and then politicians come in and create barriers and obstacles, either with formal quotas or sanctions, or through trade taxes, skewing the efficiency of the process. This is both economically and environmentally damaging, as is well known, but it is something that we are going to see, I think, more of in the coming years. The issue with the fourth industrial revolution is, of course, that we are going through a process of significant structural change. And whenever we have the structural upheaval associated with significant economic change, we see social status changing. And from that, we get the rise of scapegoat economics. Scapegoat economics occurs when people lose either income or, more usually, social status as a result of larger structural changes in the economy. Those groups that are seeing their status decline, not just in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense, so their status goes down, but their neighbor's status is going up, they are going to look for something to blame. Now, the factors behind this are very, very complex, but that complexity is not what people want to hear. So typically, someone whose status is going down will say, well, it's not my fault my status is going down. It's not my fault I've lost my job or my income is lower. It must be the fault of the foreigner. It must be the fault of immigration. It must be the fault of too many women in the work group, whatever it is. You pick a scapegoat, a single simple target in order to attack. And of course, foreigners are an ideal scapegoat in a period of structural upheaval, because foreigners do not have the vote in your local country. They don't have any voice in terms of the political process. Very often you will get xenophobic or racial overtones coming into this, and it becomes an ideal target. Foreigners are clearly other. They are different from you, and therefore they make the ideal scapegoat. Now, of course, this is all complete nonsense, but it doesn't stop politicians from exploiting the scapegoat economics. You get the rise of prejudice politics. Vote for me, we'll build a wall, we'll keep them out. In that situation, the prospects of deglobalization, of trade wars or ongoing trade conflicts, I think increases, because it is a nice, simplistic message to sell to the local population. to say, no, it's not your fault, but I am doing something to keep those foreigners out, to keep foreign goods out. You get a nationalistic approach. And economic nationalism arising out of scapegoat economics and prejudice politics is something we are already seeing, and I think which will continue in the future. The decline in trade as a share of global GDP that took place before the pandemic was, in my view, primarily the deglobalization argument. Localization is only something which is coming through more gradually. But we will see these moves coming through. If we think about the implications of localization and deglobalization, they are very, very different to the world economy. Both will reduce trade as a share of GDP, but localization is about more efficient use of resources. It is about a greater degree of waste control. Deglobalization is inherently inefficient, choosing suboptimal supply chain locations and creating weakness in the overall economic outlook. In terms of inflation, deglobalization is a source of inflation. The trade taxes that President Trump put in place led to increased costs for companies, squeezed profit margins, and in some cases, though not that many, it must be said, those squeezed profit margins then led to an increase in prices as a direct result of the trade taxes of President Trump. Localization, however, is disinflationary. We are lowering trade, absolutely. We are also lowering prices. And the classic example of this is an industry that has already entirely localized. That is the entertainment industry. 10, 15 years ago, if you wanted to buy music or film or television or computer game, you would buy it in a physical format, a CD-ROM, CD, or DVD. Manufacturing a compact disc took trade between a large number of countries. You have the manufacturer of chemicals, the manufacturer of plastic, manufacturer of paper, printing, the manufacturer of the compact disc itself, the transfer of intellectual property rights, packaging it all together, distribution. Multiple countries are involved. Now, of course, nobody buys a physical compact disc. My teenage nieces think a compact disc is something you put your drink on top of. They've got no idea what these funny circles are for. In this situation, we have seen a significant reduction in terms of costs of entertainment because we've gone to the ultimate in localization. You produce music or entertainment on your smartphone in your pocket. And that localization through digitization has dramatically reduced the cost of accessing entertainment. It's been a continual source of disinflation over the course of the last 10 years and is likely to continue to be a very low cost and a very much more efficient process of distributing entertainment to large numbers of people. Over the course of the next few years, therefore, we will see, I think, the forces of localization and deglobalization continuing to butt against each other. We will, I think, in the end, see the benefits of localization winning out, but the deglobalization, the political forces, are going to continue to be a feature of supply chains as well. I think we end up with shorter and simpler supply chains across the global economy, a decline in global trade as a share of global GDP, but we will certainly, I think, remain a very globalized economy, even with that decline. It's just a simpler process of production and one which is, above all else, seeking to minimize waste and improve efficiency over the medium term. So supply chains are changing for good and for ill, but overall, I have a sense of optimism that we will end up with increasing efficiency in how we supply goods around the world. Thank you very much.